Nobody in the small, unhurried town of Clarksville, Tennessee, expected that an ordinary Tuesday morning would reach into their lives and rearrange something permanent. It was the kind of morning that looked deceptively simple from the outside: gray skies, cool air, the smell of rain still clinging to the pavement from the night before. Cars pulled into the courthouse parking lot in the usual quiet procession. Court staff sipped coffee from paper cups. A janitor pushed a mop in slow, wide arcs across the lobby floor. Nothing about the morning announced itself as significant. And yet, inside two very different households across town, two very different lives were being prepared for a collision that neither of them could have anticipated. Lily Monroe was 3 years old, and she had the kind of face that strangers instinctively smiled at: wide brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, a spray of soft curls that refused to be tamed by any comb her mother Sarah had ever attempted to introduce, and two front teeth that were just slightly too big for her smile in the most endearing way imaginable. Before everything changed, Lily had been the kind of child who filled a room simply by entering it. She talked to her stuffed animals in full, serious conversations. She greeted the mail carrier by name every single morning. She invented songs in the bathtub and performed them at full volume with the fearless confidence of someone who had never once considered the possibility of an audience that wasn't delighted. She asked her mother approximately 47 questions a day. Sarah had counted once, laughing, during a long car ride, and each question tumbled out of her before the last one had even been fully answered. That was before. 3 months earlier, something had happened to Lily. Something that no 3-year-old should have been asked to carry, and something that her small mind and smaller heart were still trying, in their own quiet and painful way, to process. The details had wound their way through the legal system and landed on the docket of the Montgomery County Courthouse. What mattered on this particular Tuesday morning was not the legal complexity of what surrounded Lily's world. It was the effect that world had left on her. The little girl who once narrated her own life like a joyful running commentary had gone almost completely silent. Not mute, she still responded to direct questions with yes or no, still cried when she was hurt, still reached for her mother in the night, but the spontaneous, effortless, sunshine quality of her voice had simply vanished. Therapists used careful, clinical words for what they were observing. Sarah used a simpler one. She said her daughter's light had dimmed. Every morning for the past 93 days, Sarah had woken up hoping that this would be the day Lily would come padding down the hallway and announce that she wanted pancakes, or ask why the sky was blue, or demand that Sarah listen to a new song she had made up. Every morning, the house remained quieter than it should have been. Sarah had learned to fill the silence carefully: soft music, gentle questions that required only a nod, the deliberate maintenance of routine that child psychologists had told her was essential. She was doing everything right. She knew she was doing everything right. And it still felt like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, testing the ice one careful inch at a time, terrified of the moment it might give way beneath her. Then there was Rex. Rex was 4 years old, which in Belgian Malinois terms meant he was precisely at the peak of everything he had been bred and trained to be. He was not a large dog in the way that some working breeds are large, heavy-boned, slow-moving, built for endurance over agility. Rex was lean and powerful, with a coat the color of dark honey and a black-masked face that gave him an expression of permanent, focused intelligence. His ears stood straight and sharp. His eyes, deep amber, quick, and utterly alert, missed nothing. He moved with the particular fluid efficiency of an animal that understood its own body completely, every step deliberate, every pause intentional. His record with the Clarksville Sheriff's Department was, by any measure, exceptional. He had located a missing 7-year-old boy in the woods outside of town after a 14-hour search that had left experienced officers beginning to lose hope. He had detected a significant quantity of concealed narcotics during a routine traffic stop that had appeared on the surface to be entirely unremarkable. He had tracked a fleeing suspect across 3 miles of uneven terrain in the dark, and held his position with textbook precision until backup arrived. He had been commended twice, photographed with the sheriff on 3 separate occasions, and had his own small but enthusiastic following on the department's social media page, where his photos reliably generated more engagement than anything else the department posted. His handler, Deputy Marcus Cole, had been paired with Rex for 2.5 years. Marcus was 34, broad-shouldered and quietly competent in the way that the best law enforcement officers tend to be, not showy, not loud, but deeply reliable. He had requested the K-9 unit assignment specifically, telling his supervisor at the time that he believed working with a dog would make him a better officer. He had been right. What he hadn't fully anticipated was that working with Rex would also make him a more perceptive human being. He had learned, through hundreds of hours beside his partner, to read the subtle signals that Rex sent out about the environments they moved through, the slight tension in the dog's shoulders that indicated stress nearby, the particular quality of stillness Rex adopted when something was wrong before Marcus himself had registered anything unusual. Rex had made Marcus better at paying attention to the world. On this Tuesday morning, Marcus loaded Rex into the patrol vehicle at 7:15, gave him a calm, practiced command, and headed toward the courthouse for what both of them expected to be a routine security shift. Marcus had a thermos of black coffee. Rex had a tennis ball tucked beside his water bowl in the back. Neither of them had any reason to believe the day would be anything other than what it appeared to be. 2 lives moving through the same gray Tuesday morning, toward the same building, with no knowledge of each other whatsoever. The hallway that connected them was 40 feet long and smelled like floor polish and old wood. It would take Lily approximately 4 steps to close the distance between her chair and the dog who was about to change everything. She would take those steps in less than 30 seconds. The world would never quite look the same after she did. Sarah Monroe had not slept. Not really. She had drifted in and out of something that resembled sleep the way a shallow puddle resembles the ocean, close enough in appearance, utterly insufficient in substance. She had lain on her side in the dark, staring at the thin strip of light beneath Lily's bedroom door, listening for the small sounds that told her daughter was still breathing, still present, still there. The clock on the nightstand had moved with cruel slowness. 3:14, 3:41, 4:28. By 5 o'clock, Sarah had stopped pretending and simply sat up, swung her legs over the side of the bed, and pressed her palms flat against her knees the way she always did when she was steadying herself for something hard. The morning that followed was one of the most carefully managed hours of Sarah's recent life, and Sarah had become, over the past 3 months, extraordinarily skilled at carefully managed hours. She moved through the kitchen quietly, making oatmeal because Lily would eat oatmeal without complaint, pouring orange juice into the small cup with the yellow handle because Lily responded better to familiar objects on difficult days. She laid Lily's clothes out on the bathroom counter the night before: soft navy leggings, a white long-sleeved shirt, the pale pink sneakers with the Velcro straps that Lily could fasten herself, which mattered because small independent victories mattered, the therapist had said. Everything mattered. Everything was deliberate. Sarah's entire existence had reorganized itself around the project of keeping her daughter's world as predictable and as gentle as humanly possible. When she went awake Lily, she found her daughter already sitting up in bed, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, her wide brown eyes fixed on the window where the early morning light was just beginning to press through the curtains. Lily didn't look frightened, exactly. She looked the way she often looked these days, braced, as though some part of her small body was in a constant state of quiet preparation for something unpleasant. It broke Sarah's heart every single time, and Sarah had become unfortunately practiced at having her heart broken quietly, in the space of a single glance, before composing her face back into something warm and steady for her daughter's sake. "Good morning, baby," Sarah said, keeping her voice soft and even. Lily turned from the window and looked at her mother. She didn't smile, but she leaned forward slightly, her version, lately, of a good morning. Sarah took it gratefully, the way she had learned to take everything Lily offered these days without pushing for more. Getting Lily dressed was slow and gentle work. The child moved compliantly but without energy, lifting her arms when asked, sitting still for her shoes, allowing Sarah to pull a comb through those untamable curls with a patience that the old Lily, the one who used to twist away from the comb while singing loudly to drown out Sarah's requests, would never have offered. That compliance, so much easier than the wriggling resistance of before, hurt more than resistance ever had. Sarah finished the last Velcro strap, held both of Lily's small feet in her hands for just a moment, and breathed. The drive to the courthouse took 22 minutes. Sarah had driven the route 3 times in the days leading up to this morning, timing it, identifying parking, locating the entrance they would use, mentally mapping the path from the car to the waiting area so that nothing on the actual morning would feel unfamiliar or surprising. The radio played low, a children's station that Lily had loved before, that she still seemed to find soothing even in her quieter state. A nursery rhyme about a bluebird played twice on the drive over. Sarah noticed Lily's fingers, which had been pressed tightly together in her lap, loosened slightly during the second playing. She filed that away the way she filed everything, carefully, gratefully, without making too much of it aloud. The courthouse parking lot was already filling when they arrived. Sarah found a spot near the side entrance, the one she had identified on her practice runs as the least crowded and therefore the least likely to overwhelm. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, her hands still on the wheel, running through the quiet mental checklist she had developed for moments like this. Lily's snack was in the bag. The small stuffed rabbit had been tucked in as well, because the therapist had suggested having a comfort object available. The attorney had been notified of Lily's current communication patterns. Judge Wynn's clerk had been informed that the child might need additional time and patience. Sarah had done everything she could do. She knew that. She also knew that knowing it and feeling it were two entirely different things. Inside, the courthouse carried the particular atmosphere that large official buildings always seem to generate. A heaviness that isn't quite unfriendly, but is never quite warm, either. The ceilings were high, and the floors were hard, and every sound bounced off every surface in a way that made the building feel simultaneously empty and crowded. Families sat in rows of plastic chairs along the walls of the main waiting area, each group forming its own small, tense island. A toddler was crying somewhere down the left corridor. A man in a dark suit paced near the water fountain, speaking quietly and urgently into his phone. 2 elderly women sat with their hands folded identically in their laps, staring at nothing in particular with the practiced stillness of people who had learned to wait. Sarah guided Lily to a row of chairs near the far wall, away from the crying toddler, away from the packing man, positioned near a window where the gray morning light came in at a soft angle. Lily sat down immediately and resumed the posture Sarah had come to recognize as her default in difficult environments. Shoulders slightly forward, hands pressed flat against her thighs, eyes dropped to the floor. Present, but retreated. There, but not quite reachable. Sarah sat beside her and placed one hand gently over Lily's. Lily didn't pull away. She didn't squeeze back either. She simply allowed it, the way she allowed so many things now, not with resistance, but without the warm, spontaneous reciprocation that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Across the building, in a corridor that smelled of coffee and cleaning solution, Deputy Marcus Cole was moving through his own morning with the brisk, organized efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times. He had parked the patrol vehicle at 7:40, completed Rex's pre-shift check with practiced thoroughness, coat, paws, ears, temperament, and clipped Rex's official vest into place with the quiet ceremony that Marcus privately believed the dog appreciated, though he would never have said so to a colleague. Rex had stood still for the vest with his usual dignified patience, then looked up at Marcus with those sharp amber eyes, in a way that Marcus had long ago decided meant something close to readiness. They moved through the courthouse with the calm authority of a partnership that had logged hundreds of shared hours in exactly this kind of environment. Marcus noted the tension in the waiting area without being asked to. It was simply what he did, what Rex had helped train him to do. He saw the packing man, the crying child somewhere distant, the elderly women with their folded hands. He saw, without yet knowing why it mattered, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes sitting very still beside a small girl in pink sneakers whose head was bowed toward the floor. Rex's nails made their familiar soft rhythm against the polished hallway tile. The sound traveled ahead of them like a quiet announcement. In the waiting area, the young woman's head turned slightly toward the sound. The little girl beside her did not move. Not yet. But something quiet and entirely beyond the reach of explanation was already shifting in that hallway. Marcus wouldn't be able to name it later, when reporters asked him what the moment felt like before it happened. He would pause, look down at Rex, and say simply that the air felt different. Like the few seconds before a storm breaks, when everything goes very still and the world seems to be holding something in. He was 30 feet from the waiting area. Rex was walking, and a little girl in pink sneakers was about to lift her head. It happened the way the most important moments in life almost always happen, not with trumpets or dramatic announcement, not with any of the grand theatrical build-up that stories are supposed to have, but quietly, suddenly, in the middle of an ordinary breath, between one heartbeat and the next. Nobody in that courthouse hallway had their camera ready. Nobody was watching with the particular quality of attention that one brings to something expected. The moment arrived the way grace tends to arrive, uninvited, unscheduled, and so completely itself that everyone who witnessed it would spend years afterward trying to find words adequate enough to describe it and consistently failing. Lily had been staring at the floor for 23 minutes. Sarah knew, because she had been watching the clock on the wall above the water fountain with the obsessive precision of a woman who had learned that measuring time was one of the few things she could control in a season when almost nothing else was. 23 minutes of Lily sitting perfectly still beside her, hands flat on thighs, shoulders curved inward, eyes fixed on the middle distance of the polished floor as though she were reading something there that no one else could see. 23 minutes of Sarah sitting beside her daughter, close enough to feel the small warmth of her, far enough not to crowd her, holding herself in the careful stillness that had become her primary mode of being in Lily's presence these days. The waiting area had its own ambient noise, the low murmur of conversations, the distant echo of footsteps from another corridor, the occasional rustle of papers from the direction of the clerk's window. None of it seemed to reach Lily. She had developed over the past 3 months a particular quality of interior withdrawal that her therapist described in careful clinical language, and that Sarah understood in simpler, more devastating terms. Her daughter had learned to go somewhere else when the world outside became too much. She went there now, in this waiting area in this courthouse, on this gray Tuesday morning, and Sarah sat beside her and waited, the way she always waited, for the moment when Lily might decide to come back. She almost missed it. She was in the middle of a quiet, low-voiced exchange with the family attorney, a kind, methodical woman named Patricia Holt, who was going over the morning's schedule in the tone of careful reassurance she had adopted for all of her communications with Sarah, when she felt rather than saw the change. It was physical, the way significant things often are, a shift in the quality of the air beside her, a subtle alteration in the particular stillness that Lily had been maintaining. Sarah's sentence died mid-word. Her head turned. Lily's chin was lifting. It was slow, the way the movement of something very careful is always slow, the way you move when you are not entirely sure the thing you are reaching for is real, and you are afraid that moving too quickly will make it disappear. The small chin rose by degrees, and with it came the gradual reorientation of those wide brown eyes, moving up from the floor, traveling across the waiting area, passing over the seated families and the clerk's window and the bulletin board with its rows of official notices. and then continuing, traveling further, moving toward the corridor that ran along the east side of the building. Toward the sound. Because there was a sound, and Sarah heard it now too, in the same moment that she understood what her daughter was doing. It was a small sound, almost nothing, the kind of sound that would not have registered in a noisy environment but was perfectly audible in the particular acoustics of that courthouse hallway. A soft, rhythmic clicking, the measured, unhurried sound of nails against polished floor, the sound of a dog walking. Rex came into view at the far end of the corridor. He was moving at his customary pace, not slow, not fast, but with that characteristic fluid efficiency that made him seem both completely relaxed and completely alert simultaneously. Deputy Marcus Cole walked beside him, one hand loose at his side, the other holding the lead with the casual confidence of a man for whom this particular partnership had become as natural as walking itself. Rex's vest caught the fluorescent light of the corridor. His ears were forward. His amber eyes moved steadily across the environment ahead of him the way they always did, assessing, cataloging, missing nothing. Lily stood up. Later, when Sarah tried to describe this moment to Lily's therapist, to the journalist who eventually wrote the story, to the child advocacy coordinator who called from Nashville, she would always pause at this specific detail, because it was the one that undid her most completely every time she revisited it. Not the words came after, and the words were extraordinary, but the words had a logic to them that the mind could eventually accommodate. What the mind struggled to accommodate, what continued to reach into Sarah's chest and squeeze something vital every single time she thought about it, was the standing up. Because Lily had not stood up voluntarily in a public space in 3 months. Not once. Not in the therapist's waiting room, not in the pediatrician's office, not in the grocery store where Sarah had taken her twice, carefully, during quiet hours, as part of the gradual reintroduction to ordinary life that the treatment plan prescribed. In every one of those environments, Lily had stayed seated, stayed close, stayed small, as though making herself physically compact was the only protection she had left against a world that had proven itself capable of being larger and more dangerous than she had known. She stood up now without hesitation. She took one step forward, then another. Her pink sneakers moved against the waiting room floor with a soft, purposeful sound that Sarah would hear in her memory for the rest of her life. The family attorney had stopped talking entirely. The woman seated 2 chairs to Sarah's left had looked up from her phone. A courthouse volunteer near the clerk's window had gone still, her stack of papers forgotten in her hands. The waiting area had developed, without anyone deciding to make it so. The quality of held breath that a room takes on when something is happening that everyone present instinctively understands should not be interrupted. Lily walked to the edge of the waiting area and stopped. Rex was perhaps 30 feet away, still moving at his steady pace, not yet aware, or so it seemed, of the small figure standing at the boundary of the corridor watching him with an expression that Sarah, through blurring vision, recognized with a shock of pure relief as the most present, the most engaged, the most entirely and completely there that her daughter had looked in 93 days. Then Rex stopped. There was no command from Marcus. No hand signal, no verbal cue, no subtle shift in the lead that might have communicated the instruction to pause. Rex simply stopped, the way he sometimes stopped when something in the environment communicated itself to him through channels that no training manual had ever fully mapped. He stopped, and he turned his broad, black-masked head toward the small girl standing at the edge of the corridor. And for a moment, one long, suspended, improbable moment, a 3-year-old girl and a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois simply looked at each other across 30 feet of polished courthouse floor, as though they were the only 2 living things in the building, as though the fluorescent lights and the hard floors and the official notices on the bulletin board, and the adults with their legal documents and their carefully managed expressions had all fallen quietly away, leaving only this, a child and a dog, regarding each other with the complete and uncomplicated attention that only the very young and the very honest are capable of. Lily's arm came up slowly, her small finger extended, pointing directly and steadily at Rex with the particular certainty of a child who has identified something important and wants to make absolutely sure that every adult in the vicinity is aware of it. And then she spoke. The voice that came out of her was clear. It was steady. It was unmistakably, heartbreakingly hers, the same voice that had once narrated her stuffed animal's adventures and asked 47 questions on long car rides and sung made-up songs at full volume in the bathtub. The voice that had gone so quiet for so long that Sarah had started, in her most frightened moments, to wonder if she would ever hear it sound like itself again. 2 words, simple, certain, offered to a dog across a courthouse hallway as naturally as if she said them every day. Good dog. The woman 2 seats over pressed her hand flat against her chest. The courthouse volunteer set her papers down on the counter without looking at them. The family attorney exhaled slowly through her nose with the careful control of someone managing a strong emotion in a professional setting. Deputy Marcus Cole stood completely motionless, his hand loose on the lead, his expression cycling through several things at once in a way that his face, trained to professional neutrality, could not entirely contain. Rex, for his part, did something he almost never did unprompted in a working environment. He wagged his tail. Once, slowly, deliberately, as though he understood exactly what had just been asked of him and exactly what his answer was. Sarah Monroe did not manage her emotion at all. She brought both hands up to her face, and she wept silently, completely, with the full weight of 93 days of careful, managed, relentless hope finally finding the release it had been searching for. In a courthouse hallway in Clarksville, Tennessee, on a gray Tuesday morning that had given no indication of being anything other than ordinary, a little girl had pointed at a police dog and said 2 words. And everything, quietly, irreversibly, beautifully, began to change. Deputy Marcus Cole had been a law enforcement officer for 11 years. He had responded to car accidents and domestic disputes in situations that required a particular kind of emotional armor that the academy trained you for but that life itself ultimately forged. He had stood at the edges of grief and crisis more times than he cared to count, and he had developed, the way experienced officers tend to develop, a protective professional composure that served him well in almost every situation he encountered. He was not, by his own description, an emotional man. He was a practical one. He believed in procedure, in training, in the reliable architecture of preparation and protocol. He was completely unprepared for what he was feeling right now. He stood in that courthouse hallway with his hand loose on Rex's lead, and his chest doing something complicated and unfamiliar, watching a 3-year-old girl lower her pointing finger and look at his dog with an expression so open and unguarded and wholly trusting that it bypassed every professional defense he had ever constructed and landed somewhere very close to the center of him. His throat had tightened in a way he was going to pretend later had been caused by the dry courthouse air. His eyes were doing something he was going to attribute, if anyone asked, to the fluorescent lighting. He gave himself exactly 3 seconds to feel whatever he was feeling. Then he did what he always did. He moved. He moved slowly and deliberately, the way he had learned to move around frightened animals and frightened people. No sudden gestures, no large movements, nothing that might startle or disrupt the extraordinary fragile thing that was currently happening in this hallway. He brought himself down to one knee on the polished floor, bringing his large frame below Lily's eye level, making himself smaller, less imposing, less like the official uniformed authority figure he was and more like simply a person, kneeling on a floor next to a dog. Rex adjusted beside him without being asked, settling into a slightly lower posture as well, as though he and Marcus had specifically rehearsed for exactly this scenario, which they absolutely had not, because no training program on Earth could have anticipated this specific Tuesday morning in this specific courthouse hallway with this specific child. "Hey there," Marcus said to Lily, keeping his voice at the particular frequency he used with nervous witnesses and frightened children, low, unhurried, carrying no expectation in it whatsoever. "His name is Rex. He's a very good boy." He chose those words deliberately, not because he had thought them through in advance, but because some part of him understood instinctively that the best thing he could offer this child in this moment was confirmation. She had said something true. She had reached out toward the world with those two words, and he was going to make absolutely certain the world reached back. Lily looked at Marcus for a moment with those serious brown eyes, assessing him the way children assess adults they are not yet sure about. Then she looked back at Rex. Marcus turned to the woman who was clearly the child's mother. She had risen from her chair and was standing a few feet behind Lily, both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes bright with tears she was not quite managing to contain. He raised his eyebrows in a quiet question. The mother nodded immediately, emphatically, in the way of someone who would have agreed to almost anything in that particular moment. "Would you like to pet him?" Marcus asked Lily gently. Lily did not answer with words. She stepped forward. What happened next was simple and profound in equal measure. Lily placed both of her small palms flat on top of Rex's broad head, and Rex, a dog trained for precision and control, a dog whose working demeanor was characterized by focused alertness, closed his eyes. Slowly, completely, with the deep, uncomplicated contentment of an animal that has been touched by exactly the right hands at exactly the right moment. His tail moved once, low and gentle. The courthouse volunteer near the clerk's window had abandoned any pretense of working. Two attorneys who happened to be passing through the corridor had slowed to a stop without appearing to notice that they had done so. The waiting area behind them had gone collectively, instinctively quiet, the way crowds go quiet when something real is happening, and every human instinct says to stop, to witness, to not look away. It was Donna Harris who moved first. Donna was the courthouse coordinator, a compact, sharp-minded woman in her late 40s who had worked in the Montgomery County Courthouse for 19 years and who possessed, after nearly 2 decades of observing the full spectrum of human experience that passes through a courthouse on any given day, an exceptionally well-calibrated sense of when something mattered. She had been watching from the corridor entrance since the moment Lily stood up from her chair. She had seen the pointing finger. She had heard the 2 words. She had watched Rex stop without being commanded and turn toward the child and wag his tail with that slow, deliberate certainty. Donna Harris knew what she had just seen, and she knew, with the decisive clarity that 19 years of institutional experience generates, exactly what needed to happen next. She turned and walked directly to Judge Patricia Wynn's chambers. Judge Wynn was at her desk when Donna knocked and entered. She was reviewing case notes through reading glasses that she consistently claimed not to need, a cup of coffee at her right elbow that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and that she had not noticed. She looked up at Donna's entrance and registered immediately, from the particular quality of her coordinator's expression, that this was not a routine interruption. "Tell me," Judge Wynn said, setting down her pen. Donna told her, concisely, accurately, without embellishment, because Donna Harris was not a woman who embellished. She described the hallway, the child, the dog, the 2 words, the quality of what had occurred in that waiting area in terms that were factual and precise, and somehow, in their very precision, more affecting than any dramatized account could have been. Judge Patricia Wynn had been on the Tennessee family court bench for 22 years. She had presided over cases that tested every professional and personal resource she possessed. She had watched children struggle in courtrooms, had watched them shut down, act out, dissociate, freeze, and she had spent a significant portion of her career advocating, sometimes against considerable institutional resistance, for reforms that centered the needs of vulnerable child witnesses above the procedural convenience of the adults around them. She had pushed for extended recesses, for modified testimony formats, for child advocates with genuine authority in her courtroom. She had made decisions that raised eyebrows and decisions that changed outcomes, and she had never once apologized for prioritizing a child's capacity to be heard over the comfort of a system that preferred its witnesses neat and its proceedings uninterrupted. She listened to Donna Harris without interrupting. When Donna finished, Judge Wynn was quiet for a moment. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk beside the cold coffee. She looked at the middle distance of her chamber's wall with the expression of a person rapidly and thoroughly thinking something through, weighing, considering, testing the decision against every procedural and ethical framework available to her, which in her case was considerable. Then she said 4 words. "Bring the dog in." Donna nodded once and turned to go. "Donna," Judge Wynn said. Donna paused at the door. "Notify both legal teams before I take the bench. I want no objections raised in front of the child." She paused. "And find something soft for him to lie on. He shouldn't have to spend the morning on a hard floor." Donna Harris allowed herself, in the privacy of that doorway, the smallest possible smile. Then she went to make it happen. The notifications went out quickly and efficiently. Patricia Holt, the family's attorney, received the information with the careful, composed expression of a woman who was privately overwhelmed with relief and was not going to show it in a courthouse corridor. The opposing counsel, a measured man named Gerald Fitch who had 20 years of family law behind him, listened to Donna's quiet explanation, looked at the floor for a moment and said simply, "No objection." He said it in the tone of a man who had children of his own and did not require any further information to reach his conclusion. A soft blanket, cream-colored, belonging to one of the court's child support staff who retrieved it from her office without being asked twice, was folded and placed on the floor beside the chair where Lily would sit. The courtroom was quietly, efficiently rearranged. Marshall's staff were informed. The stenographer was updated. And in the hallway outside, unaware of any of it, Lily Monroe stood with both hands on top of a police dog's head, while Rex kept his eyes closed, and his tail moved in its slow, contented arc, and the adults around them managed, each in their own way, the particular quality of emotion that arrives when something broken shows its first true sign of beginning to mend. Marcus Cole looked at Rex, then at Lily, then at the mother who was still standing with her hands pressed to her mouth and tears tracking quietly down her face. He thought about all the years he had spent training with Rex, all the drills and certifications and scenarios and simulations, all the careful, rigorous preparation for every situation they might encounter. No one had trained them for this. And Rex was doing it perfectly anyway. The courtroom of Judge Patricia Wynn was not, by any objective measure, a warm or welcoming space. It was a room designed for authority and procedure, high ceilings that amplified every sound into something slightly more serious than it had been at its origin, dark wood paneling along the walls that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, rows of hard benches that communicated, with architectural clarity, that this was not a place designed for comfort. The American flag stood to the left of the bench. The Tennessee state flag stood to the right. The seal of the court occupied the wall directly behind the judge's chair with the particular gravity of an institution that has been reminding people of its own significance for a very long time. Everything about the room was deliberate. Everything about it said, "This is a place where serious things happen, and you will conduct yourself accordingly." It was into this room that a Belgian Malinois named Rex walked on a Tuesday morning in November, and changed the atmosphere entirely. He entered through the side door beside the jury box, moving alongside Deputy Marcus Cole with his customary fluid ease, and the effect of his presence on the room was immediate and difficult to articulate precisely. It was not that the room became less serious. It was more that it became, somehow, more human. As though the introduction of one honest, uncomplicated living creature, into a space built entirely around the complexities of human conflict, had quietly reminded everyone present of something they had been in danger of forgetting. That, beneath all the procedure and the language and the carefully constructed legal architecture, there were actual people in this room, with actual hearts, trying to navigate something genuinely hard. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom followed Rex as he moved down the side aisle. He did not appear to notice, or perhaps more accurately, he noticed and simply was not concerned, which amounted to the same thing in terms of his bearing. He moved with the same composed, unhurried confidence he brought to every environment: a courthouse, a forest at midnight, a traffic stop on a highway, a crowded public event. Rex did not have different modes for different situations. He had one mode, and it was this: present, calm, and completely himself. It was, Marcus had often thought, the quality he admired most in his partner and found most difficult to replicate in himself. The cream-colored blanket had been placed on the floor to the left of the small chair that had been positioned for Lily, slightly apart from the main witness area, oriented so that the child would be able to see Judge Wynn without having to face the full width of the courtroom. Someone had thought carefully about the angles. Someone had tried to make this as manageable as possible for a 3-year-old girl who had already been asked to manage far too much. Marcus guided Rex to the blanket and gave the quiet hand signal for settle, a small downward movement of the left hand that Rex had responded to reliably for 2.5 years. Rex looked at the blanket. He looked at the chair beside it. He looked at Marcus with those sharp amber eyes in the way that Marcus had learned, over hundreds of hours together, to read as something close to comprehension. Not the comprehension of language exactly, but something deeper and more instinctive than that. The comprehension of situation, the understanding of what was needed. Rex stepped onto the blanket and lay down. Not with the rigid, on-duty posture he maintained during active work, spine straight, head up, muscles carrying the particular tension of an animal ready to move at a moment's notice. He lay down the way he lay down at the end of a long day in Marcus's living room, with a slow, deliberate release of weight that started at his shoulders and moved all the way through him, until he was settled against the blanket with his chin resting on his front paws and every line of his body communicating something that looked remarkably, improbably like peace. The courtroom exhaled. It was not a dramatic sound. It was barely audible, just the collective, unconscious release of breath that a room full of people makes when something tense resolves itself unexpectedly. Judge Wynn, observing from the bench with the careful attention she brought to everything that happened in her courtroom, noted it. Her clerk, a young man named David who had worked for Judge Wynn for 14 months and had learned a great deal in that time about the difference between courtrooms where things were merely processed and courtrooms where things were actually resolved, noted it too. He wrote nothing in his notes about it. Some things resist being reduced to notation. Lily came in through the main door with her mother. She was holding Sarah's hand, not in the tight, anxious grip that had characterized most of their physical contact over the past 3 months, but loosely, with the particular quality of a child who is choosing to hold a hand rather than clinging to it out of fear. It was a small distinction. To Sarah, walking beside her daughter and feeling the difference in that grip, it was enormous. Lily's eyes found Rex before she had taken 4 steps into the courtroom. This was not surprising. Rex was not a small or inconspicuous presence, but the way her eyes found him, the directness of it, the immediate and total quality of her attention, suggested something beyond simple visual orientation. It was more like recognition, like the particular quality of attention that is reserved for things that have already been identified as safe. She walked toward him without being guided. Sarah kept pace beside her, and Patricia Holt fell into step just behind them, and the 3 of them moved down the aisle of that serious, wood-paneled courtroom with Lily leading the way toward a cream-colored blanket on a hard floor, where a Belgian Malinois was waiting with his chin on his paws, and his amber eyes tracking her approach with calm, steady attention. Lily stopped in front of Rex. She stood there for a moment, just a moment, looking down at him, with an expression that the adults in the room would each describe differently afterward, through the particular lens of their own experience and feeling. Sarah would say her daughter looked like herself for the first time in months. Dr. Albright, the child advocate who was watching from her position near the far wall, would say the child looked grounded, a clinical term that had never felt less clinical to her than it did at that moment. Deputy Cole would say, simply and without elaboration, that Lily looked like she knew exactly where she was supposed to be. Then she sat down in the small chair beside the blanket. And Rex, without any command, without any signal from Marcus, without any prompt whatsoever from any human being in that room, shifted his position on the blanket with a slow, deliberate movement, and leaned the warm, solid weight of his body gently against Lily's small legs. The contact was light. It was not the forceful press of an excited dog demanding attention. It was something far more measured than that, the careful, considered application of just enough warmth and weight and presence to be felt without being overwhelming. As though Rex had calculated, through some faculty that existed entirely outside the realm of training, exactly the right amount of himself to offer. Lily looked down at him. Her right hand came off her knee slowly, traveled the short distance to Rex's back, and settled there, palm flat, fingers relaxed, resting against the warmth of his coat with the same naturalness with which you might rest your hand on the arm of someone you trust completely. What happened to her body in the next 60 seconds was visible to every person in that courtroom, and every person in that courtroom watched it happen with the particular quality of attention that humans bring to things that are genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful. The shoulders came down first. They had been raised, not dramatically, not in the exaggerated way of someone in acute distress, but in the subtle, persistent way of a body that has been bracing for a long time and has forgotten how to stop. They dropped slowly by degrees, like something being carefully set down after being carried too long. Then the jaw softened. The small, tight set of Lily's mouth, which Sarah had been watching for 3 months with the helpless ache of a parent who cannot fix what is broken, eased into something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country as one. A relaxation of effort, a release of the constant low-level vigilance that had taken up residence in her daughter's face and refused to leave. Then the breathing changed. Sarah heard it from the chair beside Lily where she had settled herself, the shift from the shallow, careful breathing of anxiety to something slower, deeper, more sustainable. The breathing of a child who had, for this moment at least, put something down. Marcus Cole stood to the side of the blanket, Rex's lead held loosely in one hand, and watched his partner do something that 11 years of law enforcement and 2.5 years of K-9 partnership had not prepared him for. Not because it was beyond Rex's character. It was entirely consistent with Rex's character, which was what made it so affecting. It was simply that Marcus had never seen the full dimensions of that character expressed quite so clearly, quite so precisely, in quite this way before. Rex had not performed a single trained behavior since entering the courtroom. He had not tracked, or detected, or pursued, or held, or indicated. He had not done any of the things that his years of rigorous training had prepared him to do with precision and reliability. He had simply lain down beside a frightened child and stayed there. And it was, without question, the most important work he had ever done. Judge Wynne looked at the child and the dog from her position at the bench. She looked for a long moment, with the kind of attention that goes beyond professional observation into something more personal and more honest. Then she looked down at the papers before her, arranged her reading glasses on her nose, and said, in the measured, unhurried tone of a woman who had decided that this proceeding was going to move at whatever pace this child required and not one beat faster, "We'll begin when everyone is ready." No one rushed, no one shifted impatiently, no one checked a watch. For once, in a place built entirely around the pressure of time and procedure and the urgent machinery of institutional process, Everyone in that courtroom seemed to silently agree that the most important thing happening within these walls right now was a small girl breathing slowly, with her hand resting on a dog's back. And that it could wait, and that it was worth waiting for. Dr. Renee Albright had been a court-appointed child advocate for 11 years. She had sat beside children in courtrooms in 4 different states. She had guided traumatized toddlers through impossible questions with the patience of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that progress in her line of work was measured not in leaps, but in the smallest possible increments. A whispered syllable where there had been silence, a nod where there had been nothing, a single sustained moment of eye contact where there had been only avoidance. She had celebrated those increments with the quiet, private intensity of a person who understood their true weight, because she had sat in enough rooms with enough broken children to know that the smallest movement toward communication could represent the most enormous internal effort imaginable. She had prepared herself for this morning with the thoroughness she brought to every case involving a child of Lily's age and Lily's documented trauma history. She had reviewed the case files. She had consulted with Lily's therapist, a careful and experienced woman named Dr. Sandra Moore, who had provided a detailed summary of Lily's current communication patterns, her triggers, her comfort mechanisms, the specific language structures most likely to reach her, and the equally specific conditions most likely to shut her down. Dr. Albright had taken 11 pages of notes and had distilled them into a mental framework that she carried into the courtroom the way a surgeon carries the knowledge of an operation, thoroughly internalized, ready to be applied with precision and flexibility in equal measure. She had built her expectations carefully and honestly. She was not a woman who indulged false hope. She had seen too many courtroom mornings that began with cautious optimism and ended with a traumatized child unable to produce a single usable response, and she had felt the weight of those mornings deeply enough to stop pretending they were unlikely. She had told herself, on the drive to the courthouse, that a nod would be enough, that a single clearly directed yes or no would be a success worth celebrating, that anything beyond that would be a bonus she had not earned the right to expect. She had not, in 11 years of child advocacy work, prepared herself for what Lily Monroe was about to do. Dr. Albright positioned herself in the way she always did for child testimony, not behind a podium, not at a table, not in any of the formal, distance-maintaining configurations that adult legal proceedings favor, but on a low chair placed at Lily's level, close enough to create intimacy without crowding, her body angled slightly sideways to reduce the direct confrontational quality of face-to-face positioning that research had consistently shown increased anxiety in traumatized children. She had changed out of the blazer she had worn into the courthouse and was now in a soft cardigan the color of oatmeal, a deliberate choice, made after years of observing that children responded better to witnesses who did not look like the official institutional machinery that had brought them to this difficult place. She looked at Lily. Lily was sitting in her small chair with her hand on Rex's back and her shoulders in their new, lowered position, the one that had replaced the tight, braced posture of the waiting room. She was looking at Dr. Albright with an expression that contained something the advocate had not seen in any of her pre-session interactions with the child. It took Dr. Albright a moment to identify it precisely, because it was an expression she had not been expecting and therefore had not been watching for. Lily looked ready. Not in the performative sense, not with the artificial brightness of a child who has been coached and rehearsed into a simulacrum of readiness. Ready in the quiet, internal sense. The way a person looks when something inside them has settled, when some fundamental decision about whether the world outside is safe enough to reach toward has been made, and the answer has come back yes. Rex's chest rose and fell beneath Lily's hand in its slow, steady rhythm. Dr. Albright began. She started where she always started, not with the case, not with anything that required Lily to go anywhere near the difficult territory they would eventually need to approach, but with the simple, low-stakes establishment of connection and comfort that was the essential foundation of everything that might come after. She introduced herself by her first name only. She explained, in the careful, concrete language appropriate for a 3-year-old, that her job was to listen. She said that there were no wrong answers. She said that if Lily didn't know something, she could say she didn't know, and that was a completely fine and acceptable and even helpful thing to say. These were the standard opening moves of child testimony facilitation. Dr. Albright had delivered versions of this preamble hundreds of times. It was usually the longest part of the process, requiring patient repetition and gradual escalation of engagement before anything resembling responsive communication emerged. Lily answered the first question before Dr. Albright had finished asking it. It was a simple question, the simplest possible opening, designed to establish nothing more than the child's willingness to engage. Dr. Albright had asked Lily her name. "Lily Grace Monroe," the child said, clearly, completely, with the particular cadence of a child who has been asked her full name before and knows the correct answer and sees no reason not to provide it. The stenographer's fingers paused above her keys for just a fraction of a second, not long enough to constitute a professional lapse, but long enough to be noticed by anyone watching closely. Dr. Albright maintained her expression with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had trained herself, over many years, not to react visibly to things that happened in the course of child testimony, because visible reactions from adults influence child witnesses in ways that compromise the integrity of their responses. She maintained her expression. Internally, something shifted significantly. She asked the next question. Lily answered that one too. And the one after that. What unfolded over the next 34 minutes was something that no one in that courtroom had the framework to fully process in real time. It was only later, in the hallway conversations, and the follow-up meetings, and the quiet phone calls between professionals who had been present, that the full weight of what had happened began to be understood. But in the room, in the moment, there was only the experience of it, which was this. A 3-year-old girl who had not spoken spontaneously in over 3 months sat in a courtroom with her hand resting on a police dog's back and answered questions. She answered them clearly. She answered them consistently. She answered them with the kind of coherent, detailed, emotionally honest responses that child trauma specialists spend entire careers hopping to facilitate and rarely encounter in such complete and unguarded form. She described things, specific things, things that she had until this morning been entirely unable or unwilling to articulate to anyone, not to her therapist, not to her mother, not to the child psychologist who had evaluated her, not to the pediatrician, not to any of the careful, qualified adults who had been circling the edges of her silence for 3 months trying to find a way in. She found the way in herself, on a cream-colored blanket on a hard courthouse floor, with a dog's warmth against her legs and his breathing steady beneath her palm. At one point, approximately 18 minutes into the session, Dr. Albright asked a question that required Lily to describe something she had seen. It was the most significant question of the morning, the one that the entire legal proceeding had been building toward, the one that multiple professionals had assessed as the least likely to produce a usable response from a child of Lily's age and trauma profile. Dr. Albright asked it in the careful, non-leading language that her training and the court's guidelines required, and then she held herself very still and waited for whatever Lily was able to give. Lily looked down at Rex. Her hand moved slowly on his back, not anxiously, not in the distracted way of someone who is avoiding a question, but with the deliberate, grounding quality of someone reaching for something solid before stepping onto uncertain ground. Rex's breathing did not change. His body did not tense. He remained precisely what he had been since the moment he lay down on that blanket, steady, warm, present, and entirely reliable. Lily looked back up at Dr. Albright. And she answered the question. She answered it in 4 sentences. 4 clear, specific, coherent sentences that contained more usable information than 3 months of careful therapeutic work had been able to produce. Dr. Albright received those 4 sentences with the professional composure she had spent 11 years cultivating, nodded once in the calm, affirming way that acknowledged without dramatizing, and moved to the next question. It was only when Lily, unprompted, looked down at Rex midway through the session and said quietly and conversationally, "It's okay, Rex," as though she were the one providing reassurance, as though she were the one holding the room together, that Dr. Albright's professional composure came closest to its limit. She turned her face slightly to the side for a moment, took a breath, turned back. The stenographer had stopped typing entirely and was staring at Lily with an expression she was making no effort whatsoever to manage. One of the attorneys at the left table had turned to face the wall. His shoulders were doing something that suggested he was engaged in the private, effortful work of maintaining his composure, and that the work was harder than he had anticipated it would be this morning when he got dressed and drove to the courthouse, and told himself it would be a routine session. Gerald Fitch, the opposing counsel, the measured, 20-year veteran who had said no objection in the corridor with the tone of a man who had children of his own, sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and his eyes fixed on Lily with an expression that had nothing professional in it at all. Just a man, watching a child, feeling what any honest human being in that room was feeling. Judge Patricia Wynne sat at her bench and watched all of it. She watched the child and the dog. She watched the advocate. She watched the attorneys and the clerk and the stenographer and the court-marshal near the door who had crossed his arms over his chest in the particular way of a large man trying to hold himself together. She watched Sarah Monroe sitting in the gallery with both hands pressed flat against her lips and her eyes never leaving her daughter. She watched Deputy Cole standing near the blanket with Rex's lead in his hand, and an expression on his face that she suspected matched her own. When Dr. Albright concluded her session with a gentle, affirming closing exchange that Lily participated in with the same calm, present quality she had maintained throughout, Judge Wynne looked at the room for one long moment. Then she said, "We'll take a 10-minute recess," in a voice that was steady and measured and entirely her own, and brought her gavel down once with the quiet authority of a woman who needed, for just 10 minutes, to step away from her bench and stand in her chambers and place her hands on her desk and breathe. The courtroom rose. In the hallway outside, Sarah Monroe sat on a bench with her face in her hands. A courthouse volunteer appeared beside her without being summoned and set a box of tissues on the bench and sat down nearby and said absolutely nothing, because there are moments when the most compassionate thing one human being can offer another is simply the acknowledgement of their presence. Inside the courtroom, Lily was still sitting in her chair. Her hand was still on Rex's back. She was talking to him quietly, in the unhurried, conversational tone of a child who has somewhere safe to put her words at last. Rex's tail moved in its slow, gentle arc. He was listening. The story left the courthouse before the day was over. It did not leave loudly. It did not leave with the dramatic velocity of a scandal or a crisis, the kinds of stories that detonate across news cycles with the force of something designed to shock. It left the way the most enduring stories tend to leave, quietly, carried by the people who had been present, passed from one person to the next in the way that things which are genuinely true and genuinely moving have always traveled, which is person to person, voice to voice, with the particular urgency of someone who has witnessed something they cannot keep to themselves. The courthouse volunteer who had sat beside Sarah Monroe in the hallway told her husband about it over dinner that evening. She was not a dramatic woman, and she was not given to hyperbole, and her husband had learned over 31 years of marriage to pay close attention on the rare occasions when her voice took on the particular quality it had that Tuesday evening: quiet, deliberate, slightly unsteady in the way of someone describing something that has moved them more than they entirely know how to express. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That should be in the paper." His wife nodded. She had already been thinking the same thing. Peter Garland had been covering the Montgomery County Courthouse beat for the Clarksville Gazette for 6 years. He was 31 years old, thorough, unhurried in his reporting, and possessed of the particular journalistic instinct that distinguishes reporters who merely document events from reporters who understand which events matter and why. He had been in the building that Tuesday for an unrelated hearing, a zoning dispute that was generating more local heat than its actual significance warranted. And he had been in the corridor near the east waiting area when Lily Monroe pointed at Rex and said 2 words. He had not taken notes in that moment. He had not reached for his phone or his recorder or any of the professional tools that were his habitual first response to anything newsworthy. He had simply stood still and watched, the way everyone else in that corridor had stood still and watched, because some moments are larger than the instinct to document them. He took notes afterward, extensive ones, filled in from memory in his car in the courthouse parking lot while everything was still vivid and precise. He spoke to Donna Harris before leaving the building. She confirmed the facts with the careful, measured accuracy of a courthouse coordinator who understood the difference between what was appropriate to share and what was not, and she shared what was appropriate with the directness of a woman who believed the story was worth telling. He reached Deputy Cole by phone that evening. Marcus was characteristically brief, characteristically honest, and said 3 things that Peter Garland would quote in his article with the care they deserved: that Rex had done what good partners do, that the little girl had done something extraordinary, and that he hoped she was going to be okay. Peter wrote the article that night. It was not a long piece. Peter understood instinctively that the story did not need ornamentation, that the facts themselves, laid out with clarity and respect for the people involved, were more powerful than any embellishment he might have been tempted to add. He wrote 840 words. He filed it at 11:17 that evening. His editor, a pragmatic woman named Carol Simmons, who had been running the Gazette's digital operation for 4 years, and who had developed in that time a reliable sense of which stories would travel and which would not, read it at 11:45, made 3 small edits, and published it immediately rather than holding it for the morning print edition. By midnight it had been shared 4,200 times. By the following morning it had been picked up by the Nashville Tennessean. By afternoon it was on the Associated Press wire. By Thursday, Deputy Marcus Cole had 17 voicemail messages from media organizations in 5 states, and the Clarksville Sheriff's Department's social media coordinator. A 24-year-old named Jamie, who had previously considered Rex's posts the easiest and most enjoyable part of her job, was managing an inbox that had received over 3,000 messages in 48 hours. The messages were not predominantly from journalists. They were from parents, from teachers, from pediatric nurses and social workers and school counselors and child therapists and foster care coordinators, and every category of person whose professional life brought them into daily contact with children who were hurting, and who were therefore intimately familiar with how rare and how precious and how genuinely transformative a moment of unexpected connection could be. They wrote to say that the story had made them cry on their morning commute. They wrote to say that they had shared it with their colleagues and their supervisors and their teams. They wrote to say thank you, though most of them would have struggled to articulate precisely what they were thanking anyone for, perhaps simply for the reminder that healing was possible, that it could arrive from unexpected directions, that a dog on a courthouse floor on an ordinary Tuesday morning could accomplish something that months of careful professional effort had not. 3 specific responses would prove to have lasting consequences. The first came from Dr. Margaret Chen, a pediatric trauma specialist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, who had spent 15 years researching the neurological and psychological mechanisms underlying trauma-informed care in children. Dr. Chen had read Peter Garland's article on Wednesday morning and had immediately forwarded it to 6 colleagues with a single line of commentary that read, "This is exactly what we have been trying to explain in the literature for a decade, documented in real time." She reached out to Judge Wynn's office by Thursday. The judge's clerk, David, flagged the message immediately and placed it at the top of the stack. The second came from the Tennessee Administrative Office of the Courts. A formal inquiry, courteously worded but unmistakably official in its weight, asking Judge Wynn whether she would be willing to speak with the office about the circumstances of Tuesday's proceeding and the potential policy implications of what had occurred. Judge Wynn read this message in her chambers on Thursday afternoon, set it down on her desk, and allowed herself a small, private expression of satisfaction before composing her response, which was yes, she would be willing, and when would they like to meet? The third came from a child advocacy organization based in Memphis called Voices First, whose executive director, a tenacious, visionary woman named Dr. Lorraine Webb, had been advocating for the formalization of courthouse comfort animal programs in Tennessee for 3 years, and had been encountering the particular combination of bureaucratic inertia and institutional skepticism that greets most genuinely good ideas in their early stages. Dr. Webb had been compiling research, building coalitions, writing proposals, and speaking at conferences with the patient persistence of someone who believed completely in what she was doing and had made her peace with the fact that meaningful institutional change moves slowly. When she read about Lily Monroe and Rex, she did not feel vindicated, exactly. She felt something quieter and more purposeful than that. She felt, for the first time in 3 years of advocacy work on this specific issue, that the moment had arrived. She called the Clarksville Sheriff's Department on Thursday morning and asked to speak with Deputy Cole. Marcus took the call in the parking lot outside the department, leaning against the patrol vehicle with Rex sitting beside him in the way Rex always sat when Marcus was on the phone, close, attentive, unhurried. He listened to Dr. Webb for 11 minutes. He asked 4 questions. He said he would speak with his supervisor and get back to her within the week. He spoke with Sheriff Daniel Pruitt that afternoon. Pruitt was a practical man who had been running the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department for 9 years, with a combination of operational efficiency and genuine civic commitment that had earned him consistent re-election, and more meaningfully to him personally, the consistent respect of the people his department served. He had followed the developing story of Tuesday's courthouse session with the careful attention of a department head who understood that his officers and his department were now part of a public narrative, and who had thought seriously about what that meant and what responsibilities it carried. He listened to Marcus's account of the call with Dr. Webb. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, "Set up the meeting." The meeting happened the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Lily Monroe had pointed at Rex in a courthouse hallway and said 2 words. It included Deputy Cole, Sheriff Pruitt, Dr. Webb from Voices First, Dr. Chen from Vanderbilt, Donna Harris representing the courthouse, and Judge Wynn herself, who had cleared 2 hours in her schedule with the decisive efficiency of a woman who had decided that this particular meeting was more important than whatever it displaced. What emerged from that meeting was the framework for what would become, over the following 4 months, the Clarksville Courthouse Comfort K-9 program, a formal, structured, rigorously designed initiative that established clear protocols for the use of trained comfort dogs in child testimony proceedings, provided training for handlers, created evaluation criteria for participating animals, and built into its foundation the research-based understanding of childhood trauma that Dr. Chen and her colleagues had spent years developing. It was not the first program of its kind in the United States. Courthouse facility dog programs had existed in other states for years, with documented evidence of their effectiveness. but it was among the first in Tennessee, and it arrived with the particular momentum of a program born not from a policy paper or a grant application, but from a real moment, witnessed by real people, that had demonstrated in the most direct and undeniable way possible exactly what was at stake and exactly what was possible. Judge Wynne worked with county commissioners personally to secure the initial funding. She made 2 calls that she described afterward as the most straightforward fundraising conversations she had ever had. Both donors, both residents of Clarksville, both of whom had heard about Tuesday's courthouse session, and said yes before she had finished explaining what the money would be used for. Deputy Cole was invited to present at the Tennessee Law Enforcement Leadership Conference 4 months later. He stood at a podium in a conference room in Nashville in front of 260 law enforcement professionals and said what he had to say in the plainest language he could find, because plain language was the only kind he trusted for things that actually mattered. He talked about Rex. He talked about Lily. He talked about what a trained K-9 could offer in environments beyond the ones they were traditionally deployed in. He talked about paying attention to your partner, to the room, to the small signals that tell you something important is happening before you have the words to name it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then it stood up. Marcus Cole looked out at 260 people on their feet and felt something he did not have a word for and did not try to find one. He looked down at Rex, who was sitting beside the podium where Marcus had positioned him at the start of the presentation, and who was looking back up at him with those steady amber eyes. Marcus reached down and placed his hand briefly on Rex's head. Rex closed his eyes. Outside the conference room windows, Nashville moved through its ordinary afternoon, traffic and people, and the unremarkable business of a city going about its life, entirely unaware that in a room on the 4th floor of a downtown hotel, something was being set in motion that would eventually make its way into courtrooms across the state and change, in ways both measurable and immeasurable, the experience of children who had already been asked to carry far more than their small shoulders were built for. It had started with 2 words in a hallway. It was becoming something that would last. 6 months is not a long time in the life of an adult. It is the distance between one season and the next, a handful of months that pass with the particular speed of time that is filled with ordinary things, work and groceries and weekends, and the gradual, unremarkable accumulation of days that blend into one another without leaving distinct edges. 6 months can feel, in retrospect, like almost nothing, a brief chapter, a short passage between one thing and the next. In the life of a 3-year-old girl who had spent 3 of the preceding months in near silence, 6 months was an entirely different measure of time. It was vast. It was transformative. It was the difference between the child who had sat in a courthouse waiting area with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and her eyes fixed on the floor, and the child who now stood at the kitchen counter on a Saturday morning in May, wearing a yellow apron 2 sizes too large for her, explaining to her mother in considerable and enthusiastic detail exactly why the pancakes needed more blueberries, and why her opinion on this matter was correct, and Sarah's was not. Lily Monroe was talking again. Not carefully, not tentatively, not in the measured, cautious way of someone testing the safety of each word before committing to it. She was talking the way she had talked before, freely, fully, with the unstoppable forward momentum of a child who has things to say and has recovered her complete confidence in the value of saying them. She had opinions about breakfast and strong ones. She had questions about clouds and butterflies, and why the neighbor's cat looked at people the way it did, and what happened to the moon during the day, and whether fish had feelings, and approximately 40 other subjects that required Sarah's full and immediate attention. She invented songs again, new ones, with complicated verses and refrains that changed every time she sang them, and that she performed at full volume in the bathtub, with the fearless, joyful confidence of someone who has never once considered the possibility of an audience that wasn't delighted. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter on that Saturday morning in May and listened to her daughter argue the case for additional blueberries with the passionate conviction of a small person who has recently rediscovered the extraordinary power of her own voice and intends to use it thoroughly. And she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time without the shadow of worry behind it. She felt simply, completely, unreservedly happy. The photograph on the refrigerator had been there since December. Sarah had printed it the week after the courthouse session from the single image that the courthouse's administrative photographer, present that day for unrelated documentation purposes, had captured at the moment when Lily first placed her hands on Rex's head in the hallway. It was not a professionally composed photograph. The lighting was institutional, the angle slightly awkward, the background a utilitarian stretch of courthouse corridor that contributed nothing aesthetically to the image. None of that mattered. What the photograph contained, Lily's two small palms pressed flat on the broad crown of Rex's dark-masked head, both of them looking at the camera with the same quality of calm, the same unhurried ease, the same complete and mutual comfort, was worth more than any technically perfect image could have been. Sarah had framed it simply, in a plain white frame, and placed it on the refrigerator at Lily's eye level so that her daughter could see it every morning. Lily looked at it every morning. Sometimes she said Rex's name quietly to herself, the way you say the name of someone you are fond of when you encounter a reminder of them. Sometimes she said nothing, but she always looked, and Sarah always noticed and always felt the same thing, the particular quality of gratitude that does not diminish with repetition but deepens instead, becoming more itself the more times it is felt. Dr. Sandra Moore, Lily's therapist, had been conducting sessions with Lily every week since October. She was a careful, experienced clinician who chose her words with precision and did not offer professional assessments lightly or loosely. In their session review meeting with Sarah in late March, a quarterly check-in designed to evaluate progress and adjust the treatment approaches needed, Dr. Moore had described the courthouse moment as a clinical turning point of a kind she had encountered rarely in her career. Not because a dog had been involved, she was careful to clarify. The research on animal-assisted intervention was well established and the mechanisms were understood, but because of the spontaneity of it. Because it had not been arranged or prescribed or administered as part of a treatment protocol. Because it had simply happened, organically and unexpectedly, at exactly the moment when Lily's internal readiness and an external catalyst had found each other in a courthouse hallway without anyone engineering the meeting. Those moments, Dr. Moore said, were the ones that tended to hold. She was right. The progress that had begun in that hallway had not reversed, had not plateaued in the way that therapeutic gains sometimes plateau when the novelty of an intervention fades. It had continued steadily, consistently, with the particular quality of growth that is rooted in something genuine rather than performed. Lily still had difficult days. She still occasionally retreated into quietness when the world felt too large. She still sometimes woke in the night and needed her mother's presence and her stuffed rabbit and the soft nursery rhyme station playing low on the small speaker on her nightstand. The courthouse session had not erased what had happened to her. Nothing would erase that. But it had, as Dr. Moore put it with the precise language of her profession, reestablished Lily's fundamental belief in the safety of connection. And that belief, once reestablished, had proven remarkably durable. Deputy Marcus Cole brought Rex to visit Lily at her home twice in the 6 months following the courthouse session. The first visit was in January, arranged with the Sheriff's Department's blessing and coordinated through Sarah and Patricia Holt, who had remained in occasional contact with the family. It was a Saturday afternoon, cold and bright, with the particular quality of winter light that makes everything look clean and sharp-edged. Marcus pulled the patrol vehicle into the Monroe driveway at 2 o'clock, and before he had turned off the engine, he could see Lily through the front window, a small figure in a red sweater, standing at the glass with her face pressed close to it in the way of a child watching for something she has been anticipating for a long time. She was out the front door before he had finished climbing out of the vehicle. She crossed the small front yard in a determined, rapid series of steps that were almost but not quite running, the gait of a child exercising impressive self-restraint in the face of considerable excitement, and stopped in front of Rex with her hands clasped in front of her and her face wearing an expression of such complete and luminous joy that Marcus felt the same complicated thing in his chest that he had felt in the courthouse hallway and in the conference room in Nashville, and every time, in the months between, that he had thought about that Tuesday morning. Rex looked at Lily. His tail began to move. Not the slow, measured wag of the courthouse, the careful, calibrated response of a dog reading a fragile situation and offering exactly the right amount of himself. This was different. This was the full, unrestrained, whole-body happiness of a dog greeting someone he knows and is genuinely glad to see. Rex wagged with his entire back half, his amber eyes bright, his posture open and warm and completely without the professional reserve he maintained in working environments. Lily laughed. It was the first time Marcus Cole had heard her laugh. It was a real laugh, spontaneous, unguarded, rising up out of her with the effortless naturalness of something that had never had reason to be anything other than free. It was the laugh of a child who is entirely, uncomplicated herself. Marcus stood beside his patrol vehicle in a cold January driveway in Clarksville, Tennessee, and listened to Lily Monroe laugh, and made no attempt whatsoever to manage what he was feeling. He stayed for 2 hours that afternoon. Lily showed Rex her stuffed animals, introducing each one by name with the serious, ceremonial gravity of a child performing an important social obligation. Rex examined each offering with polite and genuine interest, sniffing carefully, and then looking up at Lily with those attentive amber eyes as though awaiting the next introduction. Sarah made coffee. Marcus drank 2 cups and answered Lily's questions about Rex's job with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that this child's curiosity was a gift and deserved to be treated as one. When he stood to leave, Lily looked up at him with her wide brown eyes and said, with the direct simplicity of a child who has not yet learned to wrap important things in unnecessary language, "Will Rex come back?" Marcus looked at Rex. Rex looked at Marcus. "Yeah," Marcus said, "he'll come back." He kept that promise. The second visit was in April, on a warm Saturday afternoon that smelled of cut grass and the particular sweetness of a southern spring arriving fully and without reservation. Lily was waiting on the front porch this time, sitting on the top step with her stuffed rabbit in her lap and her pink sneakers, new ones now, the old ones having been outgrown sometime in February, dangling above the step below. She saw the patrol vehicle turn onto the street and she stood up immediately, the rabbit tucked under one arm, her face doing the thing it did when Rex was coming that Sarah had privately decided was the most beautiful expression she had ever seen on any human face. The afternoon passed the way the best afternoons pass, without anyone watching the clock, without any sense of time as a resource being spent rather than simply lived. Rex ran in the backyard. Lily ran with him, her curls bouncing, her laughter filling the yard with the completely ordinary and entirely extraordinary sound of a child who is simply, thoroughly, joyfully alive. Sarah sat on the back step with her coffee and watched her daughter run and felt the refrigerator photograph come alive in front of her, not the still image of a courthouse hallway, but the living, moving, laughing truth of what had followed from that moment. The dog with his easy, open stride. The little girl with her flying curls and her whole heart in her face. The May afternoon wrapping around both of them like something that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this. Clarksville had not forgotten what had happened in its courthouse. The Comfort K-9 program had processed its first 3 cases by April, with outcomes that Dr. Chen's team at Vanderbilt was already beginning to document for the research paper that would eventually be published in a peer-reviewed journal of pediatric trauma studies. Judge Wynne had been invited to speak at a national conference on child welfare law. Peter Garland's original article had been cited in two separate policy briefs submitted to the Tennessee state legislature. Rex had been given a formal commendation by the sheriff's department at a small ceremony in February. His photograph, the one from the courthouse hallway, Lily's small hands on his broad head, was framed and hung in the department's main corridor, beside the commendations of officers who had done brave and important things in dangerous and difficult circumstances. It hung there among those photographs because it belonged there, because what Rex had done was brave in its own way, the particular bravery of showing up fully and honestly, and without reservation for something that mattered, with no training to prepare him and no guarantee of outcome, and nothing to guide him except the most essential and reliable instinct he possessed. The instinct to stay. In a kitchen in Clarksville on a Saturday morning in May, a little girl in an oversized yellow apron was still making the case for more blueberries. Her mother was laughing now, conceding the argument with the ease of a woman who has learned that some arguments are worth losing. The refrigerator photograph watched over the kitchen the way photographs of important things always do, quietly, permanently, holding the moment that changed everything in its simple frame. Outside, somewhere across town, a patrol vehicle moved through the morning streets. A dog sat in the back with his chin resting on his paws and his amber eyes watching the world pass by the window with the calm, contented attention of an animal who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he is supposed to do. A good dog. Doing what good dogs do. Staying. The end.